This is the Good Fire Podcast. Stories of Indigenous fire stewardship, cultural empowerment, and environmental integrity. Hey everybody, welcome to the first episode of Good Fire. My name is Matthew Kristoff, and I play the role of the ignorant white boy in the conversations around Indigenous culture and Indigenous burning. I am a forester, that's my background, and I host my own podcast called Your Forest, and it's all about environmental sciences. And Amy Christianson contacted me and wanted to do a whole series on Indigenous burning. And I said, what's that?
You did.
And so now this is what we're doing.
Yeah.
So what's your deal, Amy?
Yeah. So my name's Amy Cardinal Christianson. So I'm Métis from northern Alberta and Treaty 6 territory. And I'm also a fire research scientist with the Canadian Forest Service. And I work all in Indigenous fire stewardship, which is, starting to become, more and more popular. So, I was hoping to host or, develop a podcast with you just so, talk to colleagues from around the world, see what they're doing in Indigenous fire. Just to give people an idea of, where things are and where we can move, what the future could be.
For sure. And so I guess like a good place to start is like the title Good Fire.
Yep.
Right? So getting into the conversation about, Indigenous burning, cultural burning.
Yep.
What does that mean, good fire?
So, I mean, what we see in the media and, on your televisions, and we have wildfire suppression agencies that are totally devoted to, suppressing or getting rid of bad fire off of our landscape.
They don't call it bad fire.
No.
But
Well, but wildfire. But we would think of that as a bad fire. So,
traditionally in media, for sure.
So it's like these high intensity fires that are dangerous, that threaten lives, health and safety of people, that can burn homes, burn recreational values. Good fire, on the other hand, is, what we as Indigenous peoples feel like our forests need. So anytime you go and talk to elders across Canada, even though every Indigenous nation is different.
Across the world, really.
Yeah, true. I guess we find that out on this podcast, that most use fire as some sort of tool. So for some purpose. So whether it be like a cultural purpose, a subsistence purpose, so like a reason that they can live on their landscape, for kind of a cleanup thing that they can do around their communities to reduce fuel load. So I guess
fuel load meaning that the fire hazards around their community. Yeah. Yeah.
So to kind of get rid of like the dead trees, the dry grass, and the things that could contribute to a bad fire.
There you go.
A big
nice wraparound. I like it.
So that's the link. So I think what's happening, though, is that we tend to forget that good fire exists, that our forests, especially in Canada, need they need fire.
They're fire-dependent ecosystems, always have been, yeah.
Yeah, and so that's what good fire can do, a properly controlled fire, an understory fire, or even sometimes like a more high-intensity, can do good things for the forest, and it's not something that we need to be scared of as people. But right now, all that we're seeing is these bad fires that, are terrifying when you're getting evacuated from your community at midnight because there's a fire coming and you don't know where it's coming from.
Yeah. All
you see is smoke. That's scary. And that's, I think, what bringing back these good fires, they can reduce that risk of these bad fires happening. So anytime you talk to an elder about good fire, it's about cleaning up the landscape, about using fire as a tool, and also as something that sustains their culture so that they can live in that area.
Right. And I think Western science has in the past few decades has realized that fire suppression in and of itself for the purpose of stopping fires may not have been the best way to go about it, because I think I don't know when we realize it as a culture, as a Western culture, that fire is necessary for the forest to rejuvenate, and it's always been there and will always be there. And we kind of created our own powder keg situation when we started to suppress fires. Every single wildfire that started, we would stop it. Whereas those fires would normally go through and might burn a little area or a big area where it's hard to say. But we suppressed them for 100 years now, and now we have this very homogeneous. we have this very homogeneous forest landscape that's kind of just a carpet of trees and not very broken up. It's not the mosaic that supposedly it's supposed to be. And we're seeing all kinds of problems with that. And I guess Indigenous fire was part of that. Part of that was it contributed to that breaking up of the landscape and maintaining that vast amount of edge habitat and diversity in habitat and biodiversity.
Yeah,
so
the story I always like to tell is like for Canada, when settlers first came here and our Indigenous nations were, using the land as they wanted to. Most of the settler accounts are actually of kind of these park-like forests that you could, drive wagons very easily through, that animals could move through, that you could see clearly through as they kind of came and moved across from east to west across Canada. And I think that there was a big misunderstanding that was the way the forest looked naturally. Whereas that was actually likely, not all of it, but lots of it was from Indigenous practice on the land. And that's kind of what we're finding out now by doing, with Western science and looking at tree rings and other things is kind of these regular repeating intervals of burning, of these kind of low intensity burns. And so for me, that's like, then fire suppression happened, right? Because people then saw these fires. You can imagine just imagine being on the prairie and, you're just like with your little wagon, you're like
horse and
cows
buggy
and stuff. And all of a sudden, this terrifying grass fire comes racing towards you. It would be scary, right? So you can see where this whole idea of fire exclusion came from.
Totally.
Because it basically terrified people and it took away timber. So they needed timber for the economy, for their homes.
For sure.
And then it also sometimes would damage watersheds, right? So you can, in that way, you can see where that idea would have come from of getting rid of fire off of the landscape.
It came from a good place. It came from a place of protecting resources and making sure that for some reason we thought that we could manage the landscape better than nature was doing it itself, right?
Yeah, well, and that's the problem is that nobody listened to the Indigenous people who had been there for, we say since time immemorial, so since longer than oral history can remember. And they could have said, that this is like this because this is how we manage the land, how we steward the land. But, nobody asked because Indigenous knowledges were looked at as less than this kind of European settler knowledge.
Indigenous people were looked at as less than, right? They're looked at as less than human for a long time, right? So it's
so you can see how it happened, basically, how we got to this state.
Well, and then we got to a point where we were kind of forced into, right now, we have no choice but to suppress wildfire because these fires get so devastating and they've ruined so many, they blow through communities, they take out resources because they're not historically this large and this destructive, and they even burn out not just our own resources, but soil, right? They burn the soil right down to mineral layer where there's no duff layer left, where that doesn't normally happen at the scale that we're seeing at 600,000 hectares and that kind of stuff. So it's
what I hear from people too is they always say to me well, there were big fires in the past,
for sure,
and that's true. Like the Miramichi fire, there were other fires that were large. They burned large territories. They were scary back in Indigenous managed lands. But at the same time, that was, once in 100 years, right now, what we're seeing is every year, these massive fires. We had, a Slave Lake, the Richardson Complex fire, Fort McMurray. This year, we're seeing massive fires up in High Level, multiple massive fires. So that's what's, I think, where it becomes scary.
British Columbia, California, everywhere is having communities burnt through in unprecedented ways, right? This is not something that's, when you see it year after year, the last decade we've been seeing this, it becomes concerning. You realize there's something else going on besides the natural way of things. And a lot of the signs point to, the Western civilization coming onto the landscape and trying to manage the situation.
Yeah.
And it all came from the right place, and it all came from a place of good, but it was we need to try and divert back to a situation where we're using fire as a tool and not quite as afraid of it as we have been. And
well, and I think what happened was, that fire suppression came in, where we get rid of fire, knock it off the landscape, and it became almost like a military tactic, right, where we defeat wildfire. which is actually a natural force, and you're never going to defeat wildfires. Yeah. They're always going to be around. So then like in the, 60s, 70s, 80s, we saw this like all of a sudden, what they would call maybe prescribed burning pioneers or something coming forward with this new idea to, burn on the landscape. But to me, that's just Indigenous knowledge that's being, kind of taken by the colonial society,
right,
and kind of reframed according to their own liking and, put back on the landscape. But, at the same time, it is missing some things because it's only burning for one reason, which is really to reduce fuel risk and ecosystem health. Whereas there's lots of other reasons to burn and to have burning on the land that, for Indigenous peoples, we're linked to that land, right? And so by restoring the health of the forest, it can restore the health of our communities too.
Yeah, and Indigenous communities across the globe have been, through colonialization, have experienced a lot of trauma and a lot of mistreatment and a lot of, really bad things have happened. So anything we can do to try and assist Indigenous communities to try and come back is like crucially important, especially something as evident as Indigenous burning, right? As these fires going through regularly under controlled conditions, they're beneficial not only for Indigenous communities but also for the environment and for for all of society if done correctly, right? So it's
well, small fires here and there, they put off less smoke. Lots of times you don't get, a small good fire in northern Alberta would not put smoke into the city of Edmonton for like a week or something. That so that to me is where I think that we can use good fire on the landscape in a positive way for communities to kind of reduce these big fire events that we're seeing out there.
Yeah, for sure.
Like the importance of good fires to Indigenous communities is like even when we were told in Canada we couldn't burn, our elders and firekeepers still knew that it was so important that they risked jail and fines and other things to burn. There were chiefs in BC who were thrown in jail for burning.
Wow.
Because, to them, that's how important it was to the landscape. And, for them to remove that burning and what they felt was their responsibility to burn the landscape, it was worth risking jail and other things. And I think that that's one thing that, that maybe fire managers and stuff don't see or don't understand, like, well, why we were still willing and wanting to burn all the time.
Right.
It does probably to them at the time seemed a bit crazy.
Totally different perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's not coming from a place of like, I am other than, better than the nature and will manage it and bend it to my will. It's more, I am one with, I am part of this ecosystem and I will work with it, to get for common goals, right? So it's
well, our role is like given down from the Creator, right? To look after the earth, to steward the earth, right? So if you can't do that, it basically takes away who you are as a person. Like, why are you here then if you can't look after your territory or your land? I think that that's this whole concept that Indigenous peoples were tied to the land. And I mean, I'll say it over and over in this podcast probably that, we see ourselves, like, not to say it's pan-Indigenous, every nation has a different perspective, but I think that there is overlying similarities that, we see the nature as our relations, right? Like people who relied on the buffalo talk about the buffalo as their relative. On my property, I have what I call grandmother trees because I feel like they've lived longer than, well, obviously longer than me, seen more than me, and to me they're like a relative there, that so when they die it's sad and it's, so you want to be able to kind of look after them. And I think that lots of times we see ourselves as separate from these natural systems, whereas really in an Indigenous worldview we're part of that system.
We are.
So the idea of kind of national parks or conservation areas, which we get into later in this podcast series, like removing people from them and from their role in managing those seems really weird.
Yeah, it's weird that this idea of conservation to us means removing us from the equation somehow.
Yeah.
Right? Whereas like we are of nature, we're part of it. We evolved just as everything else did. Like we are of it. So it's weird that we somehow see ourselves as other than. It's weird to me, but it's important for us to start looking into this sustainability aspect of it and to really start and the Indigenous perspective is a good place to start, right? Even for Western society to start incorporating some of these ideals and being more respectful and responsible with how we treat the landscape, for sure.
Yeah, and that's one thing I think about wanting to do this podcast series is I really wanted a platform where we could speak to Indigenous peoples from around the world that are working in Indigenous fire management to just show the level of knowledge. Like it is amazing. Like it might not be textbook learning or, you know, talking about fire weather indices or things that you would normally hear at a fire conference or models or that. But just to hear people talk about, you know, like I had one elder like, oh, when I go to the forest, I know whether it's in drought because I can look at the spruce needles and just tell. So it's basically looking at the moisture content of the tree, right?
Right.
But they do that on a visual basis, so a visual observation. And there's other things like that. Like when you talk to people about, you know, when they burn, why they burn, it's like we call it the time to burn, right? It's very specific in our knowledge systems about when it's appropriate for that type of activity to take place.
For sure.
Like, so yeah, you don't get, you know, if burning is done according to protocol and according to our knowledge systems, you know, you're not getting people going and lighting fires in the middle of summer when it's the most dangerous time to burn, right?
Yeah. It's under very controlled conditions. Yeah. No, for sure.
And especially now too, one interesting thing we're seeing is, you know, because of this fire suppression thing, lots of Indigenous peoples now are firefighters. They've now kind of gone the agency route because lots of them love fire. You know, we're all pyros at
It's
heart,
a great job. I loved it. It was fun. Yeah.
Yeah. And so you kind of get that adrenaline, right? And you get paid fairly well and things. So they've now gone that route. So it's interesting because they kind of have that almost like a two-eyed seeing, like the Indigenous worldview, and then with the agency firefighting approach.
Yeah.
So I think that now we've got fire keepers that are also risk averse, right? Because they've seen the bad side of fire too.
For sure. Yeah. And it's tying it into that I think trying to convince people and society and you know, Western fire managers that the Indigenous knowledge is real, like, right? It's akin to, in their perspective, they should be respecting it as much as you know, the Western science, because when you think about it, right, like I know that when I go hunting or whatever, I spend a week out in the bush. Every single day that I'm in the bush without my phone, disconnected from the world, and it's just me with nature all day long, right? Every single day you seem to pick up more and more, and you start to recognize more and more every single day. And I know that from my own perspective, right?
Yeah, like the bird sounds around you, the wind in the trees,
just the connectiveness and everything, right? You just start to become more aware of it.
Shadows of the sun, and
you start to draw connections that you otherwise wouldn't draw, and you start to just realize more. Now imagine you've been there and your family's been there, and that's their life for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. They're going to figure out these connections and know what's going on. So to dismiss the Indigenous knowledge as not applicable is, I think, dangerous, and we can kind of prove that now, right? Like it has been dismissed. So I would love to see it come back in, and I think we're starting to see some of that, but it's a long road for sure. Yeah,
and it's different than like, so just to clarify too on like the Western science, that's the term I use too, and some people hate that term, like, because I've heard people say like, oh, you mean science in Western Canada? It's like, but it's kind of that like whole European academic mindset, you know, that things are done in a controlled setting, that the scientific method is, you know, to do something, to observe what happens and then to repeat it, you know, over and over and over again. And I think that, you know, Indigenous knowledge is basically based on that. Like for my family, you know, when they were living up trapping in northern Alberta, like if they made a mistake on where they burned or where they set up their trap line or, you know, the health of the animals in the region, they would die. Like it was pretty
the ultimate
extreme.
Consequence, right?
Yeah.
So it is science. Like I'm a real believer in the scientific method and science as a whole, and I very much think it's the way forward. But to dismiss Indigenous knowledge as non-scientific is I think is very, it's very short-sighted for sure, because there's a lot there that you know, it can be applied and it should be applied. Yeah.
And I think for me too, I think, you know, doing this podcast, and then I hope too, people start looking around their communities for Indigenous firekeepers, Indigenous elders, and even going and sitting and talking with an elder and just hearing how much they know about their environment around them, about how to burn, about animals that live in their territory, like, for example, like caribou migration paths and how they're changing through climate change.
Yeah.
Like, it's incredible. And that for them is just from observation and talking in their communities.
Yeah. And those individual observations, they may be anecdotal, but when you combine those observations across a community, all of a sudden you start to suss out real truth, right? In the same way the scientific method does. So it's, for sure. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I guess Indigenous burning is something that we need to get back on the landscape. We need more fire in a controlled setting that is... that is, it's manageable. You don't like the word manageable. I understand that, but like it's not wildfire. It's not running rampant and risking all kinds of values. It's done for a very real reason to increase biodiversity, increase cultural health, and all kinds of different stuff. So over the series of a bunch of episodes, we're going to talk to a bunch of researchers from across the globe and what they're doing to try and get Indigenous burning back on the landscape. Yeah.
And I think too, like almost everyone that we interview here is Indigenous, that's working in this field. And for me, that's super important because as an Indigenous researcher, to bringing forward my family's traditions and into this kind of, Western academic setting that we're all a bit nervous about and sharing knowledge. So I think my goal too with this is that people will listen and have like an open mind about maybe that fire management agency folks aren't the only experts in fire, that you'll see listening to this, these people know a ton about fire and about burning and there's so much to learn. And so I hope, listening to this, that you learn about fire and what it means to us as Indigenous people and getting back out there on our land bases. Yeah. And we can start to change that conversation away from firefighting to, using fire as a tool and understanding it and not being quite so afraid of it. Right. So yeah, totally. And there'll always be a space for firefighting. Like we have a lot of values on the landscape. Nobody here is saying that we should stop fighting fire because that would be insane. That would be insane. And I think every Indigenous person who lives in the North would also think that was insane. But just, getting the good fire back on the landscape too, to help reduce the amount of firefighting and suppression that we're doing. Yeah. Awesome. So I hope you guys come back for episode 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and whatever else we get out there for you. There's lots of information. We go to Australia. We go to the United States. And we talk to people that are doing research in Brazil. And fire keepers from Canada that are working in the area, some elders to share some traditional stories. Yeah, lots of really cool stuff. So, next week there'll be more coming out and every week after that until we're done. So I hope you guys enjoy it. I hope you took something from this. And we're going to do a deep dive. So we're going to get way more into it than this. This is just a skim. We're going to talk culture. We're going to talk about politics. We're going to talk about environment. We're going to inherent talk about rights, land ownership. It's pretty scary. Climate change. We're getting into some deep stuff and definitely some stuff that people will disagree with and people will agree with. So it's going to be fun. So let us know. Let us know, guys. All right. Thanks a lot, and we will catch you next week. Thanks a lot for listening, guys. This podcast was produced by me, Matthew Kristoff. And I have an environmental sciences podcast called Your Forest. And if you like good fire, you'll definitely like Your Forest. Please check it out on Apple, Google, Spotify, and Stitcher. And I hope you guys like it. We'll see you guys next week. Thanks a lot for listening. Take it easy.